Alright, so the last video was about how the two major groups within video game culture are the fans and the game creators. And how they kind of go back and forth between each other. And so the question I asked last week was, which is more central, the creators or the fans? And the answer is the games. The fans play the games and create a culture out of it. The creators create the game, but they don't have control over the culture. They simply have control over, the games being made. And anybody can make a game, so no one person has control over the culture as much as they think they do. This brings up another thing about the games. Through games, we can see the history of video game culture and how it enacts. So, through this, we're going to watch in this video about the generations of gaming and how they work. And then in some subsequent videos, we will be watching stuff. Sorry, my dog is giving me a weird look. We're going to discuss how these generations can be looked at, not just through the games, but how the games are played, how the games are viewed, and all these other things. So let's continue forward. So through video games as central, we can actually go through the console history really fast. Each console you're looking at was the top-selling console of its generation. The Odyssey was the only console released, so therefore it was the best console. It didn't sell very well. I think it sold maybe 100,000, 200,000, but it was the first console, so it started it off. Then we got to Pong, which was actually originally an arcade game, but it became this home console thing, and it started off with those little flappy things, or those little twisty things. I forget what they're called. So I'm going to call them the little twisty things, but those were the first controllers, right there. And then we moved on to a console that could play multiple games, and they weren't all just Pong variations, and that was the Atari VCS or Atari 2600. And through this, there are several kind of console mini generations. For instance, the ColecoVision, or the Intellivision, or the Atari 5200, or the Atari 7800. These all kind of fall within the same console line because at that time, the winner and leader was the Atari 2600. People continue to go back to the Atari 2600 to play it, even though there were all these other options. That doesn't mean the Intellivision or the ColecoVision were bad. They made some great games. They were just not as great as the Atari. The same goes for around 1983, the Nintendo Famicom comes out. It is the dominant console. And through that, we see a change in the controls, but also a change in the way the games are played. The Atari and Pong before it was much more of a single screen type of idea, and if there is any movement, it's very limited. The NES, when the games were played, you could scroll through things, you could kind of explore around in areas, and you could have this idea of how a game should be expansive and work within your imagination. The very next generation was the Super Nintendo, and you're probably thinking, what about the Sega Genesis? Wasn't there kind of this big debate amongst the groups? I mean, we talk about these fan wars all the time, and the truth is, that was mostly manufactured. The Sega Genesis did not sell that well. We say it does, but by all examples or information we get about game sales, it does not. And that's going to get a little more interesting later on. That doesn't mean that the Sega Genesis is bad. Once again, it's like the ColecoVision. It's not bad, it's just not the dominant group. And the Super Nintendo was dominant. It was simply an expansion of the NES. It had these new game ideas, much more expansive ideas, better graphics, very 2D centric. but they had some 3D coming in. And then the very next generation was the PlayStation. Once again, there are questions about game sales versus console sales, and there are people who are, there's proof, there's a bit of evidence that although the PlayStation was dominant, it wasn't as dominant as they said that it was. But this created a very different change in the way games were played. For Super Nintendo, for the N64 players, you would insert your cartridge and you would start playing, and you would kind of have this short little time, and you'd be like, okay, this is good. Okay, I've reached this point. I'm going to save. I'm going to walk away. Or, okay, I've died a couple of times. I've played. I'm good. I'm walking away. The PlayStation wasn't like that. It had long load times. I actually hate those load times. I've actually gone to play some old PlayStation games and really couldn't stand it. But the games were compensated for that by making it a long play. You would play Final Fantasy VII for hours on end. You would play Gran Turismo 2, which was the top-selling game for the PlayStation, for hours on end. And so we see how kind of they changed the way video games were viewed. If you were a fan of the Super Nintendo or the Nintendo, it would be difficult to play the PlayStation, because there would be times where you're like, these aren't the games I want to play. I want to be playing these 2D side-scrollers. And there aren't a lot of 2D side-scrollers for the PlayStation. There really weren't. There were a handful of shooters as we know them. There were very, very few 2D side-scrollers. I mean, some of them were really, really good, like Symphony of the Night. But for the most part, they weren't there. And it's not like Nintendo was doing any better. The Nintendo 64, I think, had 2 or 3 side-scrollers. Whereas, the previous generation, it was almost entirely 2D side-scrollers. Or 2D platform type games. So there was this major shift in the way you played and why you played. It was very much so 3D. They were talking about 3D graphics, and they were making sure that, you saw kind of a change in the way they wanted things. This doesn't mean that there weren't great games, though. The PlayStation 2 continued that idea, and it tried to talk about how it was more mature and more movie-like, which makes sense, because if you ever look at Sony, you realize that Sony owns movie companies, and it owns music companies. So they would want you to think, oh, listen to this music. I could listen to it for hours. Let's play this game, and it's going to be more like a movie. It's not about, exploration. It's about moving forward for the story. And a lot of games were like that. However, the top-selling games were all about slowly exploring this giant world, this expansive land that were totally amazing. The top-selling games for the PlayStation 2 were the Grand Theft Auto games. And San Andreas, as a friend puts it, was a beautiful piece of graffiti, as expertly done on your garage door. And I think that's a good, accurate saying of it. I actually enjoy San Andreas, but I can't help but going, every character in this is kind of evil. And there's no way we can get around this. During the same time, the games became so popular that people started to ask, okay, are these games being sold to kids? Because this has happened before. And there was a big hubbub about it, and to be honest with you, there were people who were lying through their teeth. And yes, everybody goes, oh, Jack Thompson. But really, for consoles, during this time, there was kind of this attempt to kind of do bad things. San Andreas, it actually had various forms of sexual intercourse in the game. And they recorded a video and sent it to the ratings board to be rated, and they happened to have the camera always look away from those things so that you never see that people were having sex or doing other things. So the ratings board gave it a specific rating. When the ratings board heard that parts had been skipped, they immediately went back and said, okay, it turns out you have a sex game in there, and you're telling everybody it was a mod, but really it's just a sex game, and it's open to anybody to play it. You just have to do certain things. And B, there's sex in this game. You just skipped over these parts. You have to change this or we're going to rate it X. Or adults only. AO is what the rating was. And, there was this big to-do, and really it was Sony trying to be, these big movie makers showing, well, it's the story required that we have this scene, and this is much more mature audience. And it's kind of interesting. You look at the games and you look at the game creators for the consoles. They will look at, the Sony PlayStation and say that was the beginning. The Sony PlayStation was really the beginning. We looked at the kids and we said, we are making games for these kids, this age. And when it came for the PlayStation 2, it was, okay, these kids have gotten this much older, so we're making games for them at this age. We're going to make some games for younger kids. We're also going to make some games for, a little bit older than that. And they expected for the PS3 that they'd be even more mature and they'd release games like that. And it would be much more linear for the most part for what they would sell. And it would be much more cinematic, and it would have graphics and stuff. And this would be for a more mature audience. They thought that it would just follow in the same transition as movies and music. Much to their chagrin, Nintendo released the Wii. The Wii was very much so a Super Nintendo and Nintendo type game. You got in, you played with some friends, or you played a game for a little bit and then you put it down. And this blew the minds of people who had been playing games since the Sony PlayStation had taken over. And there was, honest to goodness, kind of this feeling of anger at the people who played the Wii. Once again, there are questions about, sales numbers. The Wii, for the most part, looks like it... Oh, bother. One moment. Okay, I hope I'm recording this right now. Okay, so the Wii came out, and Sony and Microsoft were expecting a very specific, very linear type of game. These games weren't bad, but they were a very specific type. And the Wii was much more, you pick up, you play, you laugh, you put it back down. And my roommates and I loved the Wii because we can invite girls over, and the girls would play, a couple of things of bowling or tennis, and we'd have 4 people playing, and, we'd have Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam if we wanted to be a little more serious. And it was a great, great console. It just wasn't for the people who... Bloody hell. Anyway. It seems everybody is trying to tell me stuff today. Oh yeah, the phone call was from my old university. They wanted $10. Anyway, so the Wii came out and it totally dominated to the point that a lot of people didn't know what to think of it. There was a lot of kind of anger from the people who started video gaming with Sony because they said, well, this can't be video games. This isn't video games. This isn't video games. I don't believe this is gaming. And really it was gaming. It was just an old school type of thing. Nintendo sold over 100 million. They did really well, and we have verifiable proof that people really enjoyed it. And, it really expanded the video game market. The very next generation, Sony comes back with the PS4, and it's very much so like the Nintendo Wii hadn't existed. The PS4 and the Xbox One, which, by the way, the Xbox One gets really confusing because I have an original Xbox. I have an Xbox 360, but I don't have an Xbox One. I don't know where they get these naming schemes from, but it's interesting. But Sony dominates, but it is at a much, much lower sales rate than they were when the Wii was dominant. Also, game sales are down. And if I were to be honest, every person I've spoken to who's into gaming hasn't really registered the PS4. as much of anything. They're like, yeah, it just came out, didn't it? And I'm like, no, it came out 5 years ago, as did the Wii U, as did the Xbox One. There have been great games for these consoles, but this last generation has been kind of a dud. It hasn't been very interesting. Games have expanded, the graphics have gotten better, it's much more of a linear style. The big controversial ones were, I believe, 1846, where it was a 3-hour game, and it was mostly just watching somebody else move around. But this was Sony's idea of what gaming should be, an interactive movie. This next generation, Nintendo comes back, and they go, okay, we've decided to combine all the great games into one console. By the way, remember how we dominated in handheld consoles? We're making our next console a handheld and TV console. And Sony and Microsoft, for the most part, are trying to say that it's underpowered and doing all this stuff in the same way they argued against the Wii and the Wii U, but they don't really have anything to fight against it. They can't beat Nintendo at handheld. They've tried. They can't beat Nintendo in waggle controls. They've tried. They can't do specific things, and Nintendo is expanding into those markets. So Sony and Microsoft are left trying to expand into more higher depth, better graphics type systems, and they've actually said, we're giving up on the console generation as it is. We're going to make it more like the phone system, where we'll just update these upgrades to the consoles over and over again, and with the next 10 years, you're going to be playing a new console. It's going to be super powered, it's going to be great, and it's going to play games for the PS4 or in the Xbox 360 and all that stuff. And so it's an interesting thing, but the games themselves, each generation you can see a very specific type of console, a very specific type of gaming style, and there are people who really do feel weird when another gaming style takes over. So, just imagine people playing the Wii and everybody who grew up on the Sony and PlayStation 2, or the PlayStation 1 and 2 as, thinking, well, this doesn't take load times, it doesn't take hours upon hours to play, this must be a failure of a game. But it's not. It's incredibly successful. They don't know how to respond to this. The same way with Nintendo fans, when they saw the Sony PlayStation, they're like, look at these load times. This isn't very interesting. It takes forever to play a game. I don't have time for this. And it continues like that. And it's culminated in the Switch. Just watch as the generations move forward. You can see the console that wins is the one that tries to consolidate as many of the consoles together. As many of the games for each console generation together. And it's a fascinating thing. When the Switch was being displayed, I was like, okay, they're working on this generation and this style of game, and they've got this style of game and this style of game. It was quite fascinating to watch. I really am wondering if the expansion idea for the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One X are going to do anything. It's a serious question. I don't want anybody to think that I hate it, though. So, let's go on to the next type of generations, the arcade generations. Now, the truth be told, I could give you an entire history of electromechanical games, and that would last an unknown amount of time. And I don't think I have that kind of time for you. But electromechanical games came out around the 1850s. People really enjoyed them. There were a lot of cool things, and arcades have been around for so long, it's actually unknown when they began. They're older than history itself. However, we're going to start off with Pong, just because that was the first console that really started to catch popularity. It started in a bar. It was for people who were kind of drunk and wanted to compete against each other, and it sold really, really well. And Pong expanded into the console market as talked about, it was expected to just be kind of this throwaway game. In fact, Nolan Bushnell, when he assigned Al Alcorn to create it, if you look at this picture carefully, you can sort of see this weird smudge next to the Pong. That's Al Alcorn's signature. And I actually think this is the one from San Francisco. But anyway, another subject. But this is what really started the idea. And then in the next kind of idea, they would have moving systems, and Atari would really kind of try different things. There was a rule at Atari that no game should be the same as a previous game. So they worked really hard to make these games. They were a lot of fun, easy to pick up, and not like other previous games. They would eventually start making sequels like Tank 2, which makes a lot of sense. And other companies started to move into this market. They had been in the market beforehand, with electromechanical games. I mean, Sega, Midway, Activision, and others had been major arcade makers anyway. So they started to make games, and they started to create some great games. Picture right there is Joust. It's one of my favorite games from that era. It was by and far, this great two-player game if you felt like it, one-player game if you felt like it. And that was kind of the idea. You gathered in groups to kind of play. And you would see these arcade games everywhere. They would actually get rid of gambling machines at casinos and just start setting up Space Invaders and other games, which was basically one screen, and you kind of looked at it, and you moved around this screen while others moved around. Things would move around and in and out of the screen, but it was just a single screen. Then people started to make side-scrollers, and they started to get into these ideas. And around 1985, Japan saw all these games and said, okay, we need to make a standardized system for this so that when you have a cabinet, that's what it's called, an arcade cabinet, you could just switch out the game and it'll play. And so they did this. It was called JAMMA. And don't ask me what JAMMA stands for, but they were very specific on which wires, how everything would set up, what the dip switch, specifics on dip switches, power, and where each button was placed, how many buttons there were, what the buttons would do, and all of that. And within that little box, people started to expand from there. The Neo Geo was very much so based on the JAMMA system. Actually, in this picture, you can sort of see an extra button. It's supposed to start with 3 buttons. Sega was the major power in this matter. They were a major power beforehand in the electromechanical systems. And they were like, okay, we're going to kind of rule Japan. And they did. And they continued to kind of put pressure on games. This is what it should look like, or not look like, but this is what the innards should feel like, or how the innards should work. And then Street Fighter was released. And Street Fighter 2, had 6 buttons instead of 3. It had a different kind of joystick. It had a couple of different things. And more interesting than that, they started to get kind of a consoleized idea for how to make their games. They would have kind of this base console, and then they would add the game onto it. And this created the Neo Geo and the CPS 1, the Capcom System 1, and Capcom System 2. And it did really, really well. This was the market for the late 90s. And by the 1995, they had a new JAMMA system. It was called JAMMA 2.0, and they had, okay, you can add this many buttons, and this is where they will be. And the standardization said, it should be 3 buttons, but if you want to expand, this is what the expansion should look like. And the American companies actually followed suit with it. They hooked up everything to a very similar system so that it didn't matter which cabinet you had, you could just hook it up. And this really helped out arcade owners and people who wanted, to just keep their cabinets and move games around. It made the arcade owners happy. It made the arcade makers happy. It worked. But from there, they started to get into this idea of what if you just want to sit down and play a game? And that's where kind of what is a candy cab. We call them candy cabs here in the US, but they're actually just kind of the lower chair type games, and you have to actually sit down to play the game. And this is where a lot of new games came from. There is a Street Fighter version of a candy cab. There is a Neo Geo version of the candy cab. And each one of these was released so that people could kind of play them. And the candy cab was just a general purpose arcade system. You just hooked in the game and the buttons were already set up, so you could just play it right there. At the same time, there were all sorts of new ideas and new controls. And we're going to get more into controls in next week, but you can kind of see this expansion and change. And then around 2003, there was this major decline. This was the Sony PlayStation 2 came out, and they were starting to release a ton of games as compilations onto the console. And people stopped going to the arcades as much. I couldn't explain to you why. But arcades survived and did better. And they started to make more games based on, instead of their own very specific systems, the CPS-1, the CPS-2, the CPS-3, they started to just be like, okay, this is a basic PC. These are the specs. This is how it's going to be. One of the last couple of systems like that were very Sega-centric. The Naomi board was based, the Dreamcast was based on the Naomi board and vice versa. And so, the console, Sega was very much so, the arcade is just part of the console market. And Sony was like, no, arcades aren't important anymore. They're just a part of the past. And so people kind of claim that arcades died. The reality is arcades did fall down, but throughout the 2010 to today, they've been expanding. There are more arcades in Seattle and in other areas than there were 10 years ago. There are a lot more arcades. There are at least 5 arcades released every month throughout the US, and it's unknown how many arcades are opened up in Japan and other places. But the way you played these games was very different. You had this wide expansion of games. They had candy cabs that could connect to the internet and would download specific kinds of games, and they'd have a hard drive inside. They had games that were based on the Unreal Engine, a console type engine. And if you looked inside, it would just be a PC inside. The bottom right shows one of my favorite games. It's called Gunslinger Stratos 2. And from what I've been told, they now have a English specific version so that you can play the game or the tutorial and you actually know what the person is telling you. So this is a real change from the way we understand gaming and the way we understand the arcade, because it started, at that electromechanical system, and it was very simple, but it had a very clunky feel to it. And slowly it became into this kind of very smooth and its own type of thing. And, they really work on different kinds of controls now and different kinds of game types. They're very much so about the big over-the-top games and, doing things that you can't do at home. And I think that's a really a good idea, because arcades are about gathering together and kind of checking out the newest ideas, and you're supposed to feel like you're in a spaceship in a way. And, the arcade continues to expand, and you can just see every generation as you walk through, an old school arcade or a new arcade or, an arcade convention. You can just almost see the generations and how things have moved and changed because of these different standardizations and these different ideas of how things should work. For the computer, instead of giving you this entire system, and to be honest with you, the computer has had so many iterations, it would be difficult to give you a perfect one. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you to kind of pause this video and check out this link right there. It's on the bottom. I hope you can read it. And it gives this entire slideshow on the computer systems. There was a point where every company was releasing a computer, and it had a completely different operating system, and even the things that were supposed to be the same were different for each computer. It was a very consoleized computer system. And so, there's a lot of questions about how do you talk about the Commodore 64 versus the Atari 800 XL. They didn't come out at the same time, by the way, but they both kind of had this different feel to them. And then slowly there became this kind of standardization, and really it was Windows. And then slowly this company said, okay, we want this to be kind of online and you can download the games as you want. And that just basically took over the PC market. And that was Valve taking over. And that's a very simplified story, but you can see each generation, you look at a Commodore 64 and it is so different from the way we would use a computer today. Okay, so the next video is going to be on games and how the games have changed over the generations and how you can kind of see that change. Hope to see you then. Catch you later.